Every crime is a wound on the world. We're here to dissect it, layer by layer, to find the truth buried within. This is Anatomy of Crime. The air in New York City in the summer of 1977 was thick enough to taste. It was a heavy, greasy cocktail of exhaust fumes, melting asphalt, and something else. Something intangible. It was the taste of fear. The city was a wounded animal, its spirit frayed. This wasn't the New York of postcards. This was a metropolis on the verge of collapse, teetering on the brink of bankruptcy, a national symbol of urban decay, garbage piled up on sidewalks during sanitation strikes. The subway was a canvas of graffiti and a haven for petty crime, and entire neighborhoods in the Bronx looked like they'd been bombed out. It was a city living in a post-Watergate, post-Vietnam hangover, a cynical, weary place where the social contract felt like it was written in disappearing ink. And into this cauldron of anxiety, a heatwave of biblical intensity descended, clamping down on the 5 boroughs, turning apartments into ovens and tempers to a razor's edge. At night, the darkness in the outer boroughs didn't offer relief. It offered cover. For him, he was a phantom, a whisper that traveled from the Bronx to Queens, a creature of the night who hunted in the city's most vulnerable spaces, the lovers' lanes, the quiet residential streets where young couples sought a moment of privacy in their parked cars. He came without warning, a shadow in the periphery, and left behind shattered glass, shattered bodies, and a single echoing question: why? For months he was known only by the unique and brutal signature of his weapon, the .44 Charter Arms Bulldog revolver, a cannon in the world of handguns, a weapon whose thunderous report was as terrifying as its impact. The press had dubbed him the .44 caliber killer, a headline that was chilling but clinical. He was a problem to be solved, a monster to be captured, another symptom of the city's endemic violence. But then, in the spring of that year, the monster learned to speak. He left a letter, and in that moment, the entire dynamic of the case shifted from a police procedural to a psychological thriller. The hunt for a killer became a conversation with a demon. He gave himself a new name, one that would be seared into the consciousness of a generation: the Son of Sam. This was no longer just about the act of murder, it was about the performance of it. And his stage was the entire city. His audience was 8 million terrified people, and his microphone was the ravenous, competitive, ink-stained press of New York. Today, on Anatomy of Crime, we dissect the anatomy of a media symbiosis. We will explore how a disturbed postal worker from Yonkers orchestrated a public campaign of terror, not just with bullets, but with words. We will examine how he reached out and found a willing, if unwitting, partner in a legendary newsman, creating a feedback loop of fear and fame that held a metropolis captive and wrote the modern playbook for the serial killer who craves the spotlight. The story begins nearly a year before the fear reached its fever pitch on a sweltering Thursday night in the Bronx. July 29, 1976, 18-year-old Donna Lauria, a bright medical technician, sat in a double-parked 1972 Oldsmobile Cutlass with her friend, 19-year-old Jody Valenti, a nurse. They had just returned from a night out at the popular disco, Peachtree's, the Bee Gees and Donna Summer, still humming in their ears. It was 1:10 a.m., the kind of humid quiet that settles over a working-class neighborhood, like Pelham Bay when the honest people are asleep. As they sat talking in front of Donna's apartment building, at 2860 Burr Avenue, a man approached the passenger side of the car where Donna was sitting. He moved with a strange, deliberate gait, not rushing, not hesitating, a slight limp in his step. In one hand, He held what looked like a paper bag. He pulled a revolver from the bag, crouched into a combat stance, and fired 3 shots into the car in rapid succession. One bullet struck Donna Lauria in the base of the neck, severing her spinal cord and killing her instantly. Another hit Jody Valenti in the left thigh. The shooter turned without a word and walked away, disappearing into the same darkness from which he had emerged. The scene that greeted the first officers from the 45th Precinct was one of pandemonium. Donna's father, a paramedic, heard the shots and rushed outside to find his daughter slumped in the car. His desperate attempts to revive her were futile. Jody Valenti, wounded and hysterical, could offer only a vague description to the shell-shocked detectives. A white male, maybe 30 years old, about 5'8", with dark curly hair. He wasn't tall or short, fat or thin. He looked like anybody. There was no robbery, no apparent motive. The 2 young women were by all accounts good kids from loving families, with no enemies, no connections to anything that could explain such a savage, unprovoked attack. The detectives considered and quickly dismissed theories of a mob hit or a crime of passion. It was a ghost attack, a complete anomaly. There was no way for them to know that they were looking at the first brushstroke of a masterpiece of terror. 3 months passed. The leaves turned, the brutal summer gave way to a crisp autumn, and the Lauria murder remained a frustratingly cold case. Then, on October 23rd, the phantom struck again, in a secluded unlit area of Flushing, Queens. 20-year-old college student Carl Denaro and 18-year-old Rosemary Keenan were sitting in Denaro's parked Volkswagen Beetle. It was a classic lover's lane. Suddenly, the car's windows exploded inward as a fusillade of bullets ripped through the vehicle. The shooter fired 5 times. Keenan, who was driving, instinctively ducked and slammed on the accelerator, careening away from the scene. She was miraculously unhurt, showered only in broken glass. Carl Denaro had been struck in the back of the head. The bullet was a .44 caliber. He was rushed to the hospital, where he underwent emergency surgery. He survived, but the slug was so deeply embedded in his skull that surgeons couldn't safely remove it. A metal plate was inserted into his head, and his memory of the event was completely wiped away. Once again, the police had little to go on. But the ballistics report provided the first critical link. The slugs pulled from Denaro's car matched the one that had killed Donna Lauria. The NYPD now knew that the 2 attacks, in different boroughs, months apart, were the work of the same man with the same unusually powerful handgun. But with victims who had no connection to one another, it still didn't scream serial killer. It was just a pattern. A disturbing one, but a pattern without a clear motive. The killer's pattern began to crystallize a month later, on November 27th, the Saturday after Thanksgiving, in Queens Village. 2 high school students, 16-year-old Donna DeMasi and 18-year-old Joanne Lamino, were walking home from a movie just after midnight. As they stood on the porch of Lamino's house, a man approached and asked them for directions in a high-pitched voice. As they tried to help him, he produced a revolver and opened fire. Both girls were hit. Donna DeMasi was struck in the neck, the bullet passing clean through without hitting a major artery, a 1 in a million chance that saved her life. Joanne Lamino was not so lucky. A bullet struck her in the back, severing her spinal cord and leaving her a paraplegic for life. When questioned, DeMasi provided a description that was hauntingly familiar: a white male with dark bushy hair, and the ballistics once again matched. Now the police had no choice but to acknowledge the terrifying truth. They had a serial attacker on their hands. The new year brought no respite. On January 30th, 1977, the killer returned to Queens. Christine Freund, a 26-year-old secretary, and her fiancé, 30-year-old John Deal, were sitting in Deal's Pontiac Firebird after seeing the movie Rocky. They were parked in front of a wine bar near the Forest Hills Long Island Railroad station. It was just after midnight. 3 shots ripped through the car. One struck Christine Freund in the head, killing her. John Deal, miraculously uninjured but in a state of utter shock, watched the shooter get into a car and drive away. It was at this point that the press began to connect the dots in a big way. The term .44 caliber killer started appearing in headlines, giving a name to the faceless dread that was slowly seeping into the city's nightlife. Young women with dark hair began looking over their shoulders. The killer remained silent for just over a month. Then, on March 8, 1977, Virginia Voskerikian, a 19-year-old honor student at Barnard College, was walking home from class in Forest Hills, Queens. It was around 7:30 in the evening, dark but not late. This attack was different. It wasn't a couple in a car. It was a lone woman on a well-lit street. The killer was becoming bolder, more brazen. As she walked, a man appeared, pulled a gun, and shot her in the face. She died at the scene. This murder, more than any other, sent a shockwave of fear through the city. The NYPD, facing immense pressure, formed a dedicated task force, pulling more than 300 detectives from precincts all over the city. They called it Operation Omega. It was one of the largest manhunts in the city's history. Its walls plastered with maps, timelines, and the maddeningly generic composite sketch of the killer. And then came the night that changed everything, April 17, 1977, Easter Sunday. In the Bronx, just a mile from the scene of the first murder, 18-year-old Valentina Suriani and 20-year-old Alexander Esau were sitting in a parked car on the Hutchinson River Parkway service road, kissing. It was 3 a.m. 2 gunshots shattered the early morning stillness. Both were struck in the head. Both were killed instantly. When investigators arrived, they found the usual calling cards, the .44 caliber shell casings. But this time, they found something else. Lying on the street near the car was a cream-colored envelope. Inside was a 4-paragraph, handwritten letter, addressed to the captain of the 10th Homicide Precinct, Joseph Borelli. The Phantom had finally decided to introduce himself. The letter was a rambling, chilling manifesto. It was written in crude block letters, filled with misspellings and bizarre, paranoid turns of phrase. It was a direct line into a mind that was clearly disordered, but also cunning and desperate for recognition. The author claimed he was a monster, taunting the police. "I am deeply hurt by your calling me a women-hater," he wrote. "I am not, but I am a monster. I am the son of Sam." He referenced the other shootings, confirming that the disparate attacks were the work of one man, and he gave himself the name that would echo through the annals of crime. "I am the son of Sam," he wrote again, as if to emphasize it, signing off with a flourish. "Yours in murder, Mr. Monster." The police were now in an impossible position. They had direct communication from the killer, but it only deepened the mystery. Who was Sam? Was it a father figure, a demonic entity, a delusion? The letter was a psychological goldmine, but it was also a direct challenge. "Police, let me haunt you," he wrote. The existence of the letter was kept from the public for a time, a closely guarded secret within Operation Omega. But in a city with thousands of cops and a hyper-competitive press corps, secrets were impossible to keep. Once the name, Son of Sam, leaked, the media frenzy ignited. The story now had a villain with a name, a personality. The fear in the city, which had been a low-grade hum, began to crescendo into a scream. The killer had found his voice, and he was just beginning to understand its power. To understand what happened next, You have to understand Jimmy Breslin. In 1977, Breslin was more than just a newspaper columnist for the New York Daily News. He was an institution, a living landmark. He was the city's bard of the working class, a Pulitzer Prize winner who wrote with the gravelly, poetic cadence of a neighborhood bar philosopher. He wrote about cops and mobsters, politicians and punch-drunk fighters, the forgotten and the downtrodden. He gave voice to the boroughs, to the people the New York Times often overlooked. He was, in short, the authentic voice of New York, and the son of Sam, a creature born of the city's darkest corners, recognized that authenticity. He knew that if he wanted to speak directly to the people, to bypass the filter of the police, Jimmy Breslin was the man to call. On May 30, 1977, a letter arrived at the Daily News building, addressed simply to Jimmy Breslin. The handwriting was instantly recognizable. This was from him. The letter was personal, almost intimate, a piece of dark poetry from the abyss. It began, "Hello from the gutters of NYC, which are filled with dog manure, vomit, stale wine, urine, and blood." The author acknowledged Breslin's recent columns about the manhunt, suggesting he was an avid reader. He then delved deeper into his own mythology, expanding on the themes from his first letter. He wrote of his master, the mysterious Sam. "Sam's a thirsty lad," the letter proclaimed, "and he won't let me stop killing until he gets his fill of blood." He offered tantalizing, and likely false clues about his identity, and he dropped a chilling, cryptic threat that would send the city into a full-blown panic. "What will you have for July 29th? It was a direct reference to the one-year anniversary of his first murder, Donna Lauria. It was a clear and terrifying threat that he intended to commemorate the date with more blood. He was setting a deadline, turning his murder spree into a macabre holiday. He was engaging in a public dialogue, and he had cast Jimmy Breslin as his involuntary co-star. The editors at the Daily News faced a monumental decision. The police urged them not to publish the letter, arguing it would glorify the killer and cause widespread panic. But the News, locked in a bitter circulation war with the New York Post, saw the letter for what it was, the biggest, most sensational story of the decade. The publisher made the call. They would publish it. On Sunday, June 5th, under the headline, "A Letter from Son of Sam," the Daily News printed excerpts of the killer's words for all the world to see. The paper sold over 1 million copies. The city was mesmerized and horrified in equal measure. The publication of the letter was the spark that ignited the inferno of the Summer of Sam. The killer was no longer a shadowy figure whispered about in fear. He was a celebrity. His words, his bizarre theories about Papa Sam, his threats, were now public domain. He had successfully bypassed the authorities and established a direct line to the city's population. This was the birth of the symbiosis. Berkowitz, the killer, provided the content, the raw, terrifying material of his crimes. The media, in turn, provided the platform, amplifying his voice 1,000,000-fold. They gave him the fame and the power that David Berkowitz, the quiet postal worker, could never have dreamed of. Each headline, each front page featuring his chosen name, fed his ego and reinforced his sense of control. The summer of 1977 descended upon New York like a plague. The heat was relentless, a suffocating blanket that trapped the city in a fever dream. And the son of Sam was the ghost in the machine, the focus of all this free-floating anxiety. His threat to strike again on July 29th hung over the city like a death sentence. He kept to the shadows for a few weeks after his letter was published, letting the panic marinate. Then, on June 26th, he struck again. In Queens, near a popular disco called Eliphas, Sal Lupo and Judy Placido, both 17, were sitting in their car when they were shot. Both survived, but the message was clear. He was still out there. The fear that gripped New York in the following weeks was unlike anything the city had ever experienced. It was a tangible, oppressive force. The police issued a profile of the killer's likely targets: young women with long, dark, shoulder-length hair. The effect was immediate. Women across the 5 boroughs flooded into hair salons, emerging with short haircuts or newly blonde locks. Wigs became a popular, if sweltering, accessory. The city's vibrant nightlife began to wither. Couples stopped going to the movies. Lovers' lanes, once a rite of passage for young New Yorkers, became ghost towns. The media coverage reached a saturation point. The Daily News and the New York Post were locked in a daily battle for the most sensational headline. "No one is safe from Son of Sam," one screamed. They published the police sketches, which were maddeningly generic, resembling thousands of men in the city. They interviewed psychologists, who offered armchair analyses, and consulted psychics, who claimed to have visions. The Son of Sam was no longer just a crime story. He was a cottage industry. He sold newspapers by the truckload. Then, on the night of July 13th, the city itself seemed to break. A series of lightning strikes hit power stations, and New York City was plunged into darkness. The Great Blackout of 1977 was a terrifying, anarchic event. With the power out, the city's fragile social contract dissolved. Looting and arson erupted. For most New Yorkers, huddled in their hot, dark apartments, listening to the sirens and the sound of breaking glass, a single thought was inescapable. He's out there. In this perfect predatory darkness, the Son of Sam was surely on the hunt. He didn't actually strike that night, but he didn't have to. In the minds of millions, the darkness belonged to him. As the dreaded anniversary of July 29th approached, the tension became unbearable. The police presence was overwhelming. They staked out every lover's lane, every quiet street. The 29th came and went with no attack. The city let out a collective, cautious sigh of relief. The relief lasted for 2 days. On the night of July 31st, in a quiet neighborhood in Bath Beach, Brooklyn, the Son of Sam claimed his final victims. Stacy Moskowitz and Robert Violante, both 20, were on their first date. They were sitting in Violante's Buick Skylark, parked near a park overlooking the Verrazano Narrows Bridge. Moskowitz, a vibrant young woman with blonde, shoulder-length hair, did not fit the killer's usual victim profile. This was a devastating realization for the thousands of women who had changed their appearance, believing it would keep them safe. A man approached the car, a strange smirk on his face, and fired 4 times. Stacy Moskowitz was shot in the head and died hours later. Robert Violante was struck in the face and eye, blinded in one eye and losing most of the vision in the other. He would survive, but his life would be forever altered. This time, however, the killer made a mistake, a small one, a mundane one, the kind of bureaucratic error that would ultimately unravel his entire reign of terror. Near the scene of the Moskowitz shooting, a local resident named Cecilia Davis was out walking her dog. She saw a man holding something that looked like a stick just before she heard the shots. She then saw a car driving quickly away from the scene with its headlights off. More importantly, she remembered seeing that same car, a tan 1970 Ford Galaxy, parked awkwardly near a fire hydrant earlier, and a police officer placing a ticket on its windshield. It was a tiny detail, but in a case starved of concrete leads, it was a lifeline. When she reported this to the police, it didn't immediately set off alarms. But this one was different. It was specific, verifiable. A detective from the task force, James Eustace, was assigned to follow up. The police work that followed was the antithesis of the media hysteria. It was slow, methodical, and profoundly unglamorous. Detectives began the painstaking process of tracking down every single car that had received a parking summons in the vicinity of the crime scene. For days, the search yielded nothing. Then, on August 9th, a detective at the Yonkers Police Department got a hit. A ticket had been issued to a 1970 Ford Galaxy registered to a David Berkowitz, who lived at 35 Pine Street in Yonkers. The name meant nothing at first, but a quick check revealed that Berkowitz had been the subject of a complaint a few weeks earlier. His neighbor, a man named Sam Carr, had complained to police that Berkowitz had sent him threatening letters and had shot his dog, a black Labrador retriever named Harvey. The name Sam was an immediate, glaring red flag. Detectives also learned that Berkowitz was a postal worker and a registered owner of a .44 Bulldog. Suddenly, the pieces began to click into place. Investigators from Operation Omega drove to Yonkers that afternoon. They found the Ford Galaxy parked outside the Pine Street apartment building. Peeking through the windows, they saw the butt of a rifle on the back seat. More chillingly, they saw a letter on the dashboard. They had found him. The police set up a surveillance team and waited. Late in the evening of August 10, 1977, David Berkowitz walked out of his apartment building, carrying a paper bag. Inside was his .44 revolver. He got into his car. As he started the engine, police cars swarmed the vehicle, blocking him in. Detective John Falotico approached the driver's side window, his gun drawn. "Now that I've got you," Falotico said. "Who have I got?" Berkowitz smiled, a slight, almost serene expression on his face. "You know," he said. "I'm Sam." He was taken into custody without a struggle. As he was being led away, he turned to one of the detectives and said, "Well, you got me. How come it took you so long?" The man who had terrorized a city of millions was, in the end, shockingly ordinary. David Richard Berkowitz was a 24-year-old postal worker, a shy, overweight man with a history of petty crime and social awkwardness. He was not a charismatic monster or a demonic mastermind. Born Richard David Falco, he was given up for adoption as an infant. His adoptive parents, Pearl and Nathan Berkowitz, gave him a stable, middle-class upbringing in the Bronx. But he was a difficult child, plagued by insecurities and a fascination with fire. He claimed to have set over 1,400 fires as a youth. The death of his adoptive mother from cancer when he was a teenager was a key psychological blow, leaving him feeling abandoned. After a stint in the army in South Korea, he returned to New York and eventually tracked down his birth mother, who told him the story of his illegitimate birth, which seemed to deepen his feelings of rejection and anger toward women. His confession to the police was even more bizarre than his letters. He claimed that he had been receiving orders to kill from his neighbor, Sam Carr. The orders, he said, were transmitted through Carr's dog, a black Labrador named Harvey, which Berkowitz believed was possessed by an ancient demon. He told the stunned detectives that this demon demanded the blood of pretty young girls. This was the Papa Sam he had written about to Jimmy Breslin. The demonic dog story became an instant media sensation. It was a motive so outlandish it seemed like a fiction. But to the investigators and prosecutors, it felt like a performance, a convenient insanity defense. Psychiatric evaluations diagnosed him with paranoid schizophrenia, but ultimately found him competent to stand trial. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Berkowitz pleaded guilty to 6 counts of murder. On June 12, 1978, he was sentenced to 365 years in prison. In court, he caused a chaotic scene, attempting to jump out of a window and screaming, "I'd kill them all again." But the story didn't end there. Years later, Berkowitz recanted the demonic dog story, calling it a hoax. He offered a new explanation. He had not acted alone, but was part of a small satanic cult that had orchestrated the murders as ritual sacrifices. This theory was most famously explored by journalist Maury Terry in his book, The Ultimate Evil. Terry argued that Berkowitz was a member of the cult, and likely the shooter in several of the attacks, but that others were involved, including the sons of his neighbor, Sam Carr. Terry pointed to inconsistencies in eyewitness descriptions. Some described a shooter with blonde hair, and strange connections between Berkowitz's circle and other ritualistic crimes. He noted that the composite sketches for the killer in two separate attacks looked like two different people, one resembling Berkowitz, the other, John Carr, who died in an apparent suicide shortly after Berkowitz's arrest. To this day, the official NYPD position is that Berkowitz was the lone killer, but the cult theory persists, a dark and unsettling postscript to the official story, suggesting that the monster the city knew as Son of Sam may have been part of an even larger, more organized evil. Ultimately, the case of the Son of Sam is a landmark, not just for its brutality, but for what it revealed about the changing nature of crime, fame, and media. David Berkowitz was not the first serial killer to communicate with the press, but he took it to a new level. By choosing a specific high-profile journalist like Jimmy Breslin, he turned his reign of terror into a public conversation. He understood, on an intuitive level, the power of a good story. He created a character for himself, the tormented Son of Sam, and a mythology involving demons and bloodlust that was far more compelling than the sad, pathetic reality of a lonely man with a gun. We chose to dissect the anatomy of this media symbiosis because it is the element that makes this case unique. The symbiosis was a feedback loop. Berkowitz committed the crimes, which created the fear. The media reported on the fear, which amplified it, and turned Berkowitz into a household name. This fame then empowered Berkowitz, validating his sense of importance and encouraging him to continue. He wasn't just dropping bodies, he was creating content for the evening news and the morning papers. The Daily News and the New York Post, in their desperate quest for readers, became his unwitting publicists. They sold millions of newspapers on the back of his terror, and in doing so, they gave him the one thing he craved more than anything, an identity. The legacy of this symbiosis is still with us. Berkowitz created a template for the modern media-savvy killer, demonstrating that the press could be used as a tool to magnify one's impact. The terror he unleashed was not just in the muzzle flash of his .44 revolver, but in the millions of copies of his words, printed in bold ink and delivered to doorsteps across the 5 boroughs. The bullets killed 6 people, but the letters held a city of 8 million hostage. The monster's true voice was only ever the whisper of a lonely, disturbed man talking to himself in a darkened room. It was the city's own media, its roaring printing presses and its breathless broadcasts, that amplified that whisper into a scream that an entire generation would never forget. This has been Anatomy of Crime, where the truth is never simple, but always worth seeking.